This is Steve Palladino from Palladino Power Project, and I'm going to go over a review of Stryd files and power analysis for three different competitors that all participated in the U.S. Olympic Trials Marathon. And I'm going to focus on pacing strategy and the distribution of power, outlay of power, and as I'm doing this, keep in mind that there's several variables that are in play here that determine the distribution of power and pacing. And those three variables are, number one, the Atlanta course was a hilly course. There's no flat. It's basically rolling. It's always uphill, downhill, etc., etc. Number two is a windy day, so you also had to deal with the effects of wind buffeting you. And number three, you're running in packs and you're at the whims of the other runners in the packs. If you're wanting to stay within a pack and be sheltered from the wind, if someone puts an acceleration, you have to follow, or you're going to drop off the back of the pack and be exposed to the wind. So there's three elements that sort of impair or at least throw a monkey wrench into the plans of a perfect isopower run or execution of the marathon. By isopower, what I mean is even splits, staying right close to target power the whole way. That's isopower, equal. So let's look into this and delve into some of their power files and the analysis of that. So the three competitors that I'm going to be looking at are two females, one male. They're all very well prepared. They're all good to go. And they all had pretty good power targets. Their power targets were pretty spot on for them to execute at. The first runner number one, is a female with a PR of 244.52 coming in to the Olympic trials and ran 246.15, a really good race. Runner number two is a 242.24 PR marathoner, female, and ran 249.48. She was actually on target to run a sub 240, just sub 240, and we'll look at her power file and delve into what happened and why 249 as opposed to 240. The third runner is a male, 218.43 marathon PR that was set roughly about 5 or 6 weeks before the Olympic trials, and ended up running 237.50 in the Olympic trials. So let's take a look at their power files. I've got them numbered here. The first one, number one, is the runner that ended up running 246. And you can see a pretty even power. There is some. You can see that the white dotted line here is FTP, the horizontal white dotted line. You can see the runner was closer to FTP in the beginning, tailed off a little bit, but that's pretty even power. That's pretty good power distribution. I'll give you the exact numbers later on. Runner number two was starting off at running 240-ish marathon pace, but then hit the wall, and you can see power tapering off towards the end here. In runner number three, male 218 marathoner, was hovering really close to FTP, and then a longer taper off period from about the halfway point on in. So there's a quick look at things, but for purposes of explaining what might have happened, I want to go into looking at uh, glycogen utilization and utilization rates. I don't have great graphics for that, but I do have this. This is a lactate curve um, where power is on the x-axis, lower power to higher power. You can see I've got FTP or CP denoted here. They're not exactly the same thing, but for our purposes, we're gonna use the terms here. Um, as I go through, you'll see FTP would be my reference here. And then on the y-axis is blood lactate. So this is a typical lactate curve, LT2, formerly known as anaerobic threshold, somewhere in here. Maximal lactate steady state a little bit lower than that, and the so-called aerobic threshold somewhere in here. And so what we have here, without getting into a lot of detail on lactate and the lactate curve, in terms of substrate utilization, down here in the low power realm, fat as a substrate, as a contributor to ATP source, it has a larger role, and glucose has a little bit lower role, but it's still a very major player basically. So even down here, you are burning your glycogen, and but you have that fat source as another supplier of the ATP for running at this power level, this low intensity. But as you go closer to FTP, as you get into this realm, really close to FTP, you start getting into predominantly glucose as a source of your ATP for your energy. And I say predominantly because the fat is always a contributor to ATP. It's just that it can only produce so much. It's at a certain rate. So the production of ATP from glucose sources, whether it's aerobic metabolism or glycolytic anaerobic metabolism, is much higher. So it dwarfs the contribution of fat. So the bottom line is, for the purposes of this talk, realize that as we get close to FTP, glucose is starting to become the predominant source. I mean, overwhelmingly predominant source of energy. That glucose predominantly comes from muscle glycogen, which you have a limited supply. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw in marathon power here. Marathon power for these runners, for the females, it's typically around 93% of FTP, CP. And for the male athlete, it's probably closer to 94 to 95%. At those powers, those relative intensities, they're really burning the glycogen down. That's when they're here. As they get closer to here, it's even higher. And as you can see, the lactate curve, it represents the glycolytic production of ATP from glucose. So it's skyrocketing, and the rate of glucose utilization is going up because the demand for ATP is so much higher as you go to these higher intensities. So here you're burning some fat, but it's predominantly glucose, glycogen predominantly. And as you go more to the right, you're burning the glycogen at a much higher rate, glucose at a higher rate. So if you think of it as a gas tank, and here you're getting so many miles per gallon. When you hit the push the pedal to the floorboard, you're going to be getting lower miles per gallon, and you're going to be burning through that gas in the tank a lot quicker. That may not be the perfect analogy, but to get the point is that as you start drifting this way and getting to FTP and higher, you are really burning down your glycogen stores at a pretty rapid rate. You're pretty close here, so you're burning them, and you probably going to have to supplement along the way. But if you are conservative and hit your target power, you're probably going to be able to do quite well with the glycogen reserves that you have with the supplementation that you take on the course. As you get over here, it's a different story. You're burning through it a lot more rapidly. So let's go back and look at the power. And you can see that looking at runner number 1, you can see that a horizontal FTP, and you can see that there's excursions over FTP, and you're running really close to FTP for a long period of time here. So yeah, this is predominantly burning through glycogen. And when you see these excursions over FTP, it's a little problematic. And why are they there? Well, as I said at the outset, there's surges, there are hills, and there is fighting the wind. And sometimes you're just going to drift over. So let's go into this. Let's look at this in a little bit different way. What we're going to do is we're going to change the way power is depicted here and show you when the runner was actually over FTP. Where all these the red is just illustrating excursions over FTP. Power is gray. The upper power target for this marathon, for Olympic Trials Marathon, this is runner number 1, is right here. It was 201 watts. And the lower target was 197. So that was what we wanted to see for average power for that runner. And you can see, because power is stochastic, it's going to be bouncy. You're going to have times where you're a little bit below, a little bit above. If you run with power, you know that power is not just the steady line, it's bouncy. But when you throw in those other 3 elements, it becomes bouncier, and then you have these inadvertent drifts over FTP. And you can see how this runner had it distributed. They actually had a total time of 15 minutes, a little over 15 minutes through the whole marathon that they spent over FTP. And that's burning through glycogen at a high rate. For 9.5% of the total race was spent at greater than FTP. And you can see target time here, it's about an hour and 4 minutes of the 2 hours and 46 minutes was spent above that upper target. All right, so that's runner number 1 looking in that chart. Let's look at the next runner number 2, female that finished at 249. And you can see that here the time spent, or the excursions over FTP, they're sort of condensed more in this first period, which is the first hour of the race, and a little bit less. And of course, once you start hitting the wall, your overall power is dropping, but your ability to go to even 2 FTP is dropped down because of the fatigue and the loss of glycogen stores. So that's what this runner looked like. The next runner uh, you can really see the story being told right here. This runner, look at how condensed, how all these excursions above FTP, which is really not a great idea if you want to hold that all the way. So this runner had a pretty tight target window, but in this race, spent 25% of the race above the upper target limit, and 19 minutes above FTP. 19 minutes, and you can see a lot of that occurred right here, and that's probably the reason why you see this down here. So the as you're seeing here, that first hour was sort of a key thing for these runners. That first hour, and again, those three elements, whether it's hills, wind buffeting, and what the pack is doing, and probably a little excitement because this is Olympic trials for all the runners, led to some first 60-minute issues, as you saw there. So let's look at the first 60 minutes. What I'm doing here in this set is all three runners are stacked here, 1, 2, and 3, and we have the distribution into the Palladino Power Project zones. The key ones here, zone 3A, that's right here, is 88 to below 95%. 88 up to just below 95%. This is the realm that these runners will, and for that matter, for most runners, are going to execute marathons. This is a marathon power domain in here. Zone 3B is 95 to 101%, which is typically half marathon to 10K power for many runners. So it's a higher intensity than marathon power. Zone 4 is between 101 and 106%, greater than 101, less than 106%. And this is a realm that's clearly in the 10K to 5K region or domain for most runners. Zone 5 is maximal aerobic power. Basically, it's 106 to 116%, or basically around 5K power to mile to or 1,500 meter power for many runners. And then above that, zone 6, that is maybe from mile power to maybe 400 meter power for most runners, maybe even to 200 meter power. And zone 7 is maximal power. It's less than 20-second power for most people. So as you're seeing here, there's similarities here. In the first two ladies that ran, spent most of their time in that zone 3A, that marathon power domain. But you can see the runner 1 actually spent some time below that and spent a little less time in these upper zones above that marathon power domain, a little less time than did this runner number 2. Runner number 2 looks like she spent a little bit more time in this domain just above marathon power in that 95 to 101% realm. And then runner number 3, you can see is greatly skewed. Admittedly, he typically runs his marathons at the upper end of this domain here, this 3A domain. He runs his marathons at the upper end of that, so there's going to be some spillover here with the stochastic nature of power. But nevertheless, this should be the predominant. This should be lesser, and then you shouldn't quite see this amount of time spent. This is what these charts are: time spent in each of those domains. But let's take a look at the first 60 minutes using that other chart that I mentioned where we're looking at the actual um, excursions over FTP. So this is runner number one, the first 60 minutes. And what we see here is it's pretty evenly distributed. There were lots of excursions, but they're very brief. They're very brief excursions. This is a little bit of a concern right here because there's a bunch of them stacked together. So this runner, during this period of time, also look in this early part, the amount of time that's being spent above this upper target, the upper target being 201 watts. A lot of time spent there. So this runner spent about 29 minutes above upper target. In that first 60 minutes, so 49% of the time, the runner was spending above target, the upper target. So a little bit aggressive. And this is one that you don't like to see at all. I mean, if it's a flat marathon, you probably won't see it this way. But 8 minutes of the 60 minutes, or 8.5 minutes of the first 60, 14% was spent above FTP, burning off glycogen stores. Number two looks a little bit better. She spent only 6 minutes 40 seconds, roughly 11% of the time above FTP, but this is the one that is the concern. There's a lot of time spent. 33 minutes. So 55% of the time, the runner was above the upper target that we had talked about. Most concerning is right here. You can see these are not just little brief excursions over FTP. This one I went back and measured. This is 1 minute at 108%. This is 1 minute at this is a minute and 3 seconds at about 107%. This is a little downhill, so it's a little up and then a little falls flat and then up again. This was 2 minutes and 45 seconds at 103% of FTP. That is a solid block of again, much higher glycogen utilization rate. Now, whether the pack was surging or what, I know there was a hill involved, but this combined with this over here, the amount of time spent above the upper target, more than 55% of the time, those were concerning. Then we have runner number three. This is the first hour. The first hour, you can see a lot of time spent over FTP, a lot of time spent over the upper target, not much time spent below. Over 50% of the time, 52%, 31 minutes spent above the upper target, but this one's the key. 27% of the time for the first hour, 16 minutes, was spent over FTP. That is burning those glycogen stores down at a very high rate and not leaving much for the latter part of the race. There's a very busy slide. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, but we'll start from the bottom, work up. Basically, what we have is the targets, the upper and lower targets for each of the runners. By the way, I will be, when I put this video up on YouTube, I will provide a link to the PDF of these slides so you can go back and check these out and spend some more time if you like. But the bottom is the upper and lower targets for each runner. The next one going up is the first 60-minute power and then the overall power. And you can see that runner number one was, I already said, was a little bit over aggressive early on, and did, had a negative power split basically. or close to a negative power split. Um, that was more pronounced with runner number two, who exceeded the target by the upper target by 3 watts. This runner by 2 watts. This runner, number three, actually was in target range for average power, but as we see, the big one was spending 16 minutes above FTP in that first 60 minutes, spending 27% of the time above FTP. The next row is the total time above upper target and the percentage of time above upper target. And I think for number two, this was a key element, spending 55%, 33 minutes above the upper target, above her upper target. That was key. She did well, I think pretty well here. Only 6 minutes above, or 6 minutes and 40 seconds above FTP in that first 60 minutes. So she did well there, but she was hovering above that target quite a bit, and spent quite a bit of time. All the runners spent, 50% ish or more of their time above their upper target. Yeah, that's to be expected to a certain degree because the stochasticity of power. If you're hovering at a target line, you're going to have some of it above and some of it below. But I'd rather see them hovering the lower target line a little bit closer in that first 60 minutes than the upper target line. So there's a quick synopsis of this slide. Like I said, I'll put the PDF of the slides in the notes under the YouTube. Fortunately, what I had for athlete number two and athlete number three, I also had comparable races. So athlete number two ran a PR within 6 months of the marathon, a PR race. So I could compare the Olympic trials to the PR race for athlete number two. So this is the PR race, is 2:42. This is the Olympic trials, 2:49. And you can see this one here. You can see the first part. You can see that FTP line, and you don't see a lot of excursions. And you can sort of see that the general power execution is happening below that FTP. Here, things are drifting a lot more over FTP, particularly those two longer excursions over FTP. So that's what the power looked like. Let's look at that chart that looks at power over FTP. This was the PR race. Look at this. This is the first hour. I have the hour demarcated here with this vertical line. Very little time above FTP. 5 minutes and 44 seconds above FTP, only 3.6% of the time. However, and you also look at the target time. This is for the whole marathon. I'm sorry, I said for the first 60 minutes. This is for the whole marathon. The runner spent 5 minutes and 44 seconds above FTP for the whole marathon. Spent a lot less here and had a lot left here to really start pushing it in. So the PR race, it looks like that. And then the Olympic trials looks like this. You can see a lot more front loading of those excursions over FTP. And again, this is the overall time. So I'm going to go back. There it is for the PR race. And admittedly, this is on a flat course. But just the same, glycogen utilization is glycogen utilization. It doesn't care what kind of course you're on. If you're burning it off in the beginning, you're not going to have it at the end. And so this is the PR race, and there's the Olympic trials race. Now those are the overall races. And you can see the targets are pretty similar. This is 215 to 218, and the runner actually executed 217. And here the targets were the similar. The athlete was in better fitness, and the target was a little bit higher, 220 to 217, or 217 to 220. But let's look at the first 60 minutes. Here's the PR race. Look at that. It's a lot of time being spent in that sweet spot domain for marathon running. Again, 88 to 95%, just below 95%. So very, very condensed into that particular domain. But as you get out here, you can see more time in Olympic trials spent in these upper zones where you're burning the glycogen at a much higher rate, much higher utilization. So there's the first 60 minutes. Let's look back at that chart, looking at time over. Again, this is the first 60 minutes for the PR race. First 60 minutes. There's some excursions. They're brief, but only 2%, 1 minute and 11 seconds was spent over FTP in the first hour of this PR race. And only 41% of the time was above that upper target level. So only 24 minutes and 37 seconds were spent above 218 watts. That's the PR race, and there is the trials. Much more time, 33 minutes versus 24 minutes above the target level. 1 minute above FTP versus 6 minutes and 40 seconds above FTP. So it's dramatically different. And again, harder conditions because of the hills, the wind, pack surges, etc. in the Olympic trials, but certainly you can see the differences and how it may have impacted the outcome. This is, and I have to apologize because the first 60 minutes is the first listed here and the second listed over here for Olympic trials. But I've already gone over some of these things. In the PR race, it was almost ISO power. We're going to call it ISO power. The total race was 217 watts. The first 60 minutes was executed at 217 watts. Only 2% or 1 minute of the first 60 minutes was spent over FTP. 24 minutes above the upper target, 41% of the time above upper target. Whereas in the Olympic trials, the first 60 minutes were a little bit overpowered, and there was 11% or 6 minutes and 40 seconds versus that 1 minute and 1 minute and 11 seconds over here. So much more time spent over FTP, and more time, 33 minutes versus 24 minutes in that first 60 spent over the upper target. Now let's look at athlete number 3, and same thing. I had power files from the PR race, which was about 5 or 6 weeks before the Olympic trials. And this is the PR race. Again, look at this FTP. There's the FTP line, and you can see a lot of time spent below FTP, right at the target, and not many excursions above versus down here in that first 60 minutes or so. A lot of time spent really close to FTP and a lot of time above it. So dramatic differences there in the overall. This is overall for the PR race. And you can see fewer excursions over FTP early on, only 11 minutes in that first hour. And, or the overall, I misspoke. This is the overall. This is the total race, not the first 60 minutes. So the total number of excursions over FTP was 11 minutes for the whole race. 11 minutes. And you can see that they're more backloaded here. There's fewer excursions over here, more conservative running here, allowed higher excursions up here, and dealing with some of the wind that was present in the final stages of this PR race. This is the overall for the Olympic trials. And you can see a front-loaded, heavy amount of time spent over FTP early on. And let's look at the distribution. This is the PR race. And like I said, he typically runs very close to the saddle point between zone 3A and zone 3B. So you're going to expect a little bit more time in 3B than you'll see in other runners, or over 95% and under 95% here. So, but compare that to down here, what you see in the Olympic trials, where there's a lot more time spent over 95%, which is sort of the border here. A lot more time spent over 95% of the FTP. And this is over 101%. This is over 106%. So you can see it's pretty clearly evident that there's a lot of time spent in those higher zones burning glycogen down. This now is the first 60 minutes. So in the first 60 minutes of the PR race for this runner, the runner spent only 3 minutes and 23 seconds over FTP. In the Olympic trials, again, this is the first 60 minutes, the runner spent 16 minutes over FTP. That right there is the tail of the race. You spend that much time over FTP, burning the glycogen down, you're not going to have much left for the end. So again, the targets were not that much different here in the PR race. It was right around 349. Here we talked about maybe going a little bit higher if was feeling good, and he executed that to the average pretty well, but because of the hills and the wind and pack surges, etc., there was just too much time. 16 minutes, 27% of the time in the first 60 minutes spent over FTP, and 52% of the time spent over the upper target versus only 40% in the PR race. 19 minutes versus 11 minutes overall, or more importantly, 16 minutes versus just over 3 minutes spent over FTP in the Olympic trials versus the PR race. So there you have it. There's a review. It is sort of looking at how the execution, somewhat forced by the route and the wind and surges, etc., how the execution created a scenario where the glycogen utilization is probably much higher than what you want, and much higher than if you're running closer to isopower, and consequently had effects on all three runners actually, that diminished their ability to hold isopower. But in two runners, the latter two, number 2 and number 3, it more significantly impaired their performance. So